Welcome to the third session of this series on conducting literature reviews. In this session, we will focus on conducting an appraisal of the studies. So, what we've done so far, you've motivated the review, you've identified what those studies would be, which will form the final corpus for your review. It is now time to look into each of these papers and understand what's happening within each of these so you're able to clearly discuss how the state of literature has panned out over the years. All right. So, one of the first things that we will typically do when you start off this process of discussing what has been uh, captured in the literature so far is to present a summary of descriptive data, which primarily says as to how many articles were published during several years, where were these authors from, what countries were in focus, were there any empirical papers, were there any conceptual papers, theoretical papers, were there any discussion papers that were included within your literary corpus. And this is more of descriptive statistics on what you found or what is that final corpus that forms your literature, that is part of your literature review. There is also something called a citation score, and here is the formula for it in terms of identifying the most influential articles. That's where this will really come in handy. And citation score is a simple division of the total number of citations by the number of years after the article publication. Now, if you look at this Paul and Feliciano Sister or 2021 article, you will notice that these are the seven top articles, with the citation score being the highest for the first one and lower in comparison for the seventh. And what they've done is to capture the number of citations, total number of citations, and years as on Jan 30th, 2020, from 1998 to that date. And that's the way in which they've arrived at a citation score or a weighted average number of citations. This primarily helps you identify which of those articles that have mostly influenced the field in the past several years as part of your review. Now, I would like you to pay some attention to what has been listed here. What we are saying is, if you recollect in the previous session, we looked at downloading an Excel or a CSV file, a spreadsheet, which includes all the articles and their abstracts and several others. Now, when you start your review process, by that I mean when you start to read each paper that is a part of your literary corpus, I would advise that these are some of the columns that you may want to create in an Excel or maybe even in a Word document, wherever you want to capture them. So let's take an example, right? So let's say you're reading through a paper A. Now you want to include what are the key points that were discussed across each of the focal constructs, the focal phenomenon that is part of your paper. Now, what was the type of the study? Was it empirical, non-empirical? What was the method that was used? What gaps in the literature were highlighted? What was the research question that this paper was dealing with? Was there any theory that was applied? What are the hypotheses? What was the research model? What were, because we're talking about hypothesis and research model, document what the IVs were, the independent variables, the dependent variables. Were there any moderators, mediators? Were there any control variables that had been introduced? How was the sample identified? What regions, what demographic details were part of the sample? What are the analytical techniques that were used? How are these constructs, which are part of your IVs, DVs, etc., how are they operationalized? What are some of the key results and what was the contribution of the paper or the implications of the paper to research and practice? Now, if you're able to diligently capture each of these details as part of your reading of these papers, that will help you in several ways when you go about discussing each of these papers, narrating what you've found, or maybe even in terms of helping you identify the research profile, like you saw here, right? So we've put in a few aspects. So all of these aspects will become a lot easier if you have diligently been able to capture these points for every paper that was part of the literary corpus for your review. Now, all that is great, but I would like you to pay attention to this post where they've clearly called out that it's not, while it is great to read through these papers, it doesn't end at that. The profile is not sufficient. It ends up becoming too descriptive if you are spending pages and pages just describing the papers. There's always an often the option for the reader to go back and read through the details within those individual papers. Now, your interest should not be as much in describing each of them in a lot of detail. Of course, a summary or key aspects of each of these papers can be discussed, but it's more important in terms of how do you advance this field of research based on what you have found so far. So if you can actually put together a future research agenda, this is something that I will keep stressing upon again and again. That is where, in terms of setting a future research agenda, that you really contribute to this literature. Now, we talked about capturing some points as part of your review. Yet another important aspect is to code, engage in coding as far as capturing details from each of the papers is concerned. Now, there are several softwares that are available out there. Um, NVivo is one of them, which can actually use for coding. Um, and very important, going back to the transparency, replicability, it's important to engage several coders. And like you see in this article 2021, the coding was also verified through a degree of team agreement with no evident inconsistency. So if you're engaging more coders, there is a certain aspect of intercoder reliability, and that helps you substantiate what you've found. Now, on the right is what you find in terms of thematic foci and illustrative coding. It's also important to call out what some of the illustrations from the literature are. So that helps you understand what has been reviewed, what has been some of the codes that were generated, and so on. Yet another example where you will see that there has been some coding that has happened, and there are some second order themes and aggregate dimensions that have been generated. Now, how do you go about identifying themes? Well, when you review literature, one of the key aspects you end up with is identifying themes. And there are several approaches to do this. One of them is content analysis, another is thematic analysis. Now, what you do within content analysis is you analyze and code the selected articles, and it's always advised that you engage more than one coder in the process. So you can arrive at a certain level of intercoder reliability, makes it more reliable, makes it more transparent, and do it in an iterative way where you're going back and forth between the data and the emerging themes and categories and compare the codes. The intent over here should be to aim for high intercoder agreement in the overall coding process. Here is an illustration again when in terms of themes and thematic mapping, there's also something that you can explore in terms of co-citation analysis and use a technology or a tool like a WASP viewer, where some of these interrelations and the intellectual structure will become more evident, where the connections will emerge between the different clusters with the sub-themes and the clusters which are identified through the process. Now, structuring the findings. We saw something similar in one of the previous sessions, where each paper, this is an article by Webster and Watson 2002, where you will notice that each article you have identified what the focal concepts are. So let's say article 1 is dealing with B and C, which are the concepts. Article 2 does not deal with C or D, but it only focuses on A and B, and so on. Or if you want to do a double click on this and take it a little deeper, there is articles in terms of unit of analysis, right? So what is the unit of analysis uh, in each paper, and so on. Now, here is an example, right? So we are looking at, say, the citation. What methodology did the paper focus on? What were the focal constructs like infrastructure, information repositories? So this one just was just focused on technical skills and so on. Now, analyzing and synthesizing data. If you remember in the first session, we talked about narrative reviews, where you're primarily describing the information that are found in the primary studies through text. You're narrating it. Now, cumulative and aggregative reviews, they generally, if you notice, will add some quantified data. Beyond the qualitative aspect, there is some quantification that has happened, frequency analysis, and even some other complex statistical techniques could be used. Now, it's important that you present all of this with enough detail so they're able to critically evaluate whatever you've concluded as part of your paper. And for systematic reviews, SLRs, any interpretations that you've done, qualitative interpretations, you want to back them up, you want to clearly call it out, and you also ensure that whatever you've concluded is very transparent and any conflicting results are addressed through the entire process of doing an SLR. So if you found anything which is opposite to one another, it's important that you identify that and you also address any such conflicting aspects. Now, Webster, so when we look at what the advice on literature, reviewing literature has been and extending it, so Webster and Watts in 2002, they had offered advice on how to synthesize findings by categorizing articles. So that's the one we were looking at, right? Instead of categorizing set of ideas across articles, you were categorizing the articles itself, which is where you developed a concept matrix of sorts. Now, in order to reclaim a narrative in which the theoretical progress is very crucial, right? So grounded theory is one such thing which comes to your rescue. Now, it forces the reviewers to focus on the researched concepts because that gives you a very disciplined way of approaching the findings, analyzing it, integrating it, and deriving insights out of it. So grounded theory comes really handy in the entire process. Now, let us look at some of the coding procedures in this regard. So types of coding. The first is open coding. Uh, Moving on further, there's axial and then selective coding. Now, what happens within open coding? And maybe when we talk about an example, no, this will become a lot more clearer. Now, open coding, which is where you just kind of read excerpt after excerpt within your set of articles. Now, several concepts will start to emerge out of this. And one of the things that is very essential over here, reviewer, which is actually the author here, right? So who's writing or reviewing the papers right now, the creative skills, the analytical skills come to the forefront, and it's very crucial because that's the that's the skill which is essential for you to be able to identify some of the emergent codes and the concepts. Now, what happens with an axial coding is that you start to connect between some of these categories and subcategories. So the interrelations become evident, and these higher order categories is what will eventually go on to represent the main themes within the entire process of identifying themes within the reviewed literature. And any patterns will also start to become very, very clear when you get move on from open coding to axial coding. The last of them is selective coding, which is where you integrate and refine the categories that were identified. Now, moving to an example, that's when it will become a lot more clear. So try and absorb the slide. What is happening over here is that you're reading through these articles, you will find that there are cars and trucks. So those are some of the aspects that are emerging in the open coding stage. Now, when you go into axial coding, and the concept means of transformation is a so-called a category. So now the category is that higher order conceptualization. So means of transportation is what is identified as a concept. It's a so-called category at a higher order conceptualization stage. Now, if you look at cars and motorbikes, right? They're intended to transport people. So person transportation might be identified as a category. Now, that could become a subcategory of means of transportation because there could be other such transportation mechanisms. So in the concept in the context of means of transportation at an axial coding level, that could become a subcategory whereas means of transportation could actually become a higher order category. And selective coding is where the relationships between the main categories are actually established. This is just an illustration of what we spoke on the previous slide. Like for example, over here you will see examples from literature, then you will see some of the learning modes, which is where you're moving towards themes. And even in this Hasan et al. Paper from 2022, you will notice that there are some of these categories which kind of then roll up to antecedents, consequences, moderators, miscellaneous, and so on, where you've not been able to group them. Now, grounded theory to analyze the data. So, this paper, 2013, what the author suggests is you pick a random paper and any, I mean, of course, in the context of your literary corpus that you are set out to review, pick a random paper, highlight any findings and insights that are relevant to what you're reviewing and the research questions that you have in mind, or and then you kind of keep doing that for all the other papers. Once you have read the papers, you do a set of open, axial, and selective coding, the ones that we just spoke on the previous slide. And when these concepts and subcategories start to emerge, that's where you engage in a comparative analysis, where you are continuously comparing and relating and linking the identified categorizations with each other. And when you're reading these, it's important that, going back to the transparency aspect of it, you got to document the coding process in terms of how did you go about it. And theory development, that can take on various forms, because at the end of the day, that's one of the areas that you may want to target, right, in terms of developing and advancing theory. So when theory building is the focus of your entire exercise, uh, you should obviously focus on what you found from empirical. The empirical findings is very essential, and that leads to explanation of the findings, and also you got to offer insights into what in the past and prospective research might be seen as relevant to the wider world. Anything in the context of theorizing. So uh, that is very essential when you're applying grounded theory to analyze the data. Again, just going back to some of these themes and aggregate dimensions, you will see here that there were several first order categories which roll up to second order themes, which then roll up to a governing intervention or challenges posed by digital platforms and other dimensions, which are aggregate dimensions. Describing the logic, that's where we talked about documenting the process. If you look at this article from 2010, they've clearly called out uh, that grounded theory was implemented in terms of the processes, the process steps within this, in terms of open theoretical coding, etc., and inductive approaches motivated the formation of themes. And how did they go about identifying the themes? So, presenting these findings in a very clear, methodical fashion will be very essential. And when you talk about the research profile, you could also kind of make it even more interesting by including certain other findings from the data analysis. Over here, the authors actually put together a temporal heat map, which just calls out as to how each of the research topics have evolved or grown popular or have come down in popularity over the years. Uh, and here is just an example of how the themes have been identified and what the overarching sub themes and categories are. All right, so that kind of brings us to the last part of this session, where, as an activity, assuming you're already in the process of doing a literature review, you could potentially pick a few papers that will form your literary corpus, or if you've already identified it, then pick 10 papers from that literary corpus and perform these coding procedures on these papers. And try and see if you can identify 2 to 3 themes that emerge from this entire process that you followed from the coding procedures, open coding and so on, axial coding and all of that. All right, before we close this session, a checklist for self-validation. You want to ask yourself these questions at this stage. Have you extracted the information to fulfill the purpose of the review and research question? So have you documented all of it? So we saw several bullet points, right? Have you documented all of that information? And how rigorous has been the way in which you've done the coding process? And in terms of documenting the steps, have you documented clearly what the coding steps have been? And is there consistency in terms of what categories and subcategories you've identified? So, I mean, if you've engaged more than one coder, you will get to that in terms of rigor and also in terms of consistency, given that given the assumption that there's going to be a high inter-coder reliability. Okay, with a quick recap, let's end this session. First, What did we discuss over here? We looked at evaluation parameters and we looked at how you got to present a research profile. We looked at the coding process where we looked at reading, rereading, and coding the papers. How do you go about synthesizing this data in terms of identifying categories and subcategories and presenting the themes, which is where you talk about each theme in detail, what literature formed uh, a part of that theme, and what did that literature discuss within the context of that particular theme. Thank you.